African Americans experienced oppression, disenfranchisement, and violence during this time period. Rutherford B. Hayes' election in 1876 brought an end to Reconstruction. Without Reconstruction, Republicans lost political power in the South because ex-Confederates took back control of the government. Many Southerners felt that federal intervention was a disturbing invasion of their rights. The thousands of lives lost during the Civil War meant that Southerners were not going to sit on the sidelines while the federal government controlled their state houses. Ex-Confederate politicians wanted to redeem the Southern way of life and disenfranchise black voters. Southern Democrats disregarded the 14th Amendment and even condoned violence. By 1895, South Carolina had adopted the Tillman Constitution, which helped legally disenfranchise African Americans. Race relations were incredibly tense, and in November of 1898, issues came to a head in Phoenix, South Carolina. Phoenix was home to a riot that resulted in the deaths of at least 8 African Americans. Many African Americans were lynched, and those who had assisted them lost their homes and were exiled from the Greenwood area. This event gained national attention. However, not much was done to prevent violence like this from happening in the future, and no legal action was taken on the lynch mobs who had committed these atrocities. The McKinley administration had turned a blind eye to these events, and it was clear that African Americans would not be assisted by the government in gaining social, political, or economic equality.
The riot started on November 8th when Thomas Tolbert, the brother of Red Tolbert, set up a polling place for African Americans who were denied the right to vote. Shortly after the polls were set up, J.L. Etheridge, accompanied by many more Democrats, sought to stop Thomas Tolbert from collecting affidavits from African Americans. Etheridge knocked the ballots from Tolbert's hands and beat him over the head with a stick. Joe Circuit, an African-American bodyguard for Thomas Tolbert, reportedly hit Etheridge in the head with a metal object, which fractured his skull. Shooting immediately commenced, and Etheridge was hit with a gunshot wound to the head. Thomas Tolbert was reportedly shot several times and was critically injured. Tolbert was taken down the road to his relative's house, where he was being treated for a punctured lung and several pellets through his ears, back, and face. Thomas Tolbert, injured in bed, was confronted by Etheridge's friend. However, upon seeing him in critical condition, decided to spare his life. However, this did not stop them from searching for African Americans who they thought may have been present at the shooting of J.L. Etheridge. The group of men assembled a lynch mob to find the people responsible for the death of Etheridge. Carnage ensued for several days. The mob hunted down innocent African Americans and killed them for being present at the polls the day of the shooting. African Americans were driven off the Tolbert's land and their churches were burned. On November 10th, the lynch mob continued growing larger and larger as men from Greenwood, South Carolina, Columbia, Edgefield, and Abbeville assembled to drive the African Americans from Phoenix. Eventually, the Tolberts were arrested and taken to jail on the grounds for inciting a riot. They were moved to a state penitentiary where the lynch mob would not assault them.
Sadly, law enforcement had done nothing to stop the lynch mob's violence against African Americans in Phoenix. In fact, 30 years later, a newsman stated that if Negroes were to be killed, it was no place for the sheriff, in that day and times, to take action on behalf of African Americans. There were plenty of political promises, though. Red Tolbert met with President McKinley to discuss the riots. During that, McKinley made it clear that he was planning a trip to the South to take action. However, nothing was ever done to the men who brutally lynched and drove African Americans from their land. The government took no steps towards ending the disenfranchisement of African Americans in the post-war era. With virtually no protection under the law and no voice in the government, it was clear that African Americans weren't equally represented in post-war South.
The Phoenix Riot stood for a common idea of how Southern society should operate. African Americans were given a place in society after the Civil War, but that place was hardly better than slavery. Southerners pushed for disenfranchisement across the South because they believed blacks to be like second-class citizens. Like the Phoenix Riots, Paragould in Greece County, Arkansas, demonstrated further persecution and oppression of African Americans based solely on race. Throughout Paragould, white supremacists took racial cleansing to achieve its goals. Sundown towns emerged to wipe out African Americans entirely. Since blacks were not allowed to stay in Paragould overnight, they were not welcome to live there either. With the Ku Klux Klan arriving in Arkansas in 1868, violence was the main tool used to instill fear in those willing to fight back against white supremacy. This racial cleansing emerged because of a supposed murder of Monroe Pulley, yet there is no documents of this event. As white supremacists have always found a way to push their agenda, it's not far-fetched to assume this murder never happened. Across the South, the Ku Klux Klan became the paramilitary arm to the Democratic Party. Clearly, the Phoenix Riots were not a one-time occurrence, and they point to a cultural issue in the South. African Americans were persecuted based on race, a tradition that set back the progress of race relations for decades.